That eerie silence that falls over the land after the violence stops. Do not mistake that for peace, family. That was never peace. It was a demonic permission slip, a spiritual green light for the true slaughter to commence. When the war drums finally ceased their pounding and the flags trampled into the bloody mud, nobody was coming to rescue the dying men. They were coming to make sure they never got back up. Soldiers who were too broken to even lift their weapons felt the cold sting of judgment as iron blades slid quietly between their ribs to finish the job. Bodies that were still warm with life were picked clean like a vulture's feast, because in this beast system, a properly harvested corpse was worth a fortune, more money than most of those poor souls had seen in their entire existence. We have spent generations brainwashed by Hollywood and the education system romanticizing medieval warfare as some glorious display of brilliant flanking maneuvers and honor. They sold us the lie of the cavalry charge, breaking the enemy line, and the noble hero standing defiant until his last breath. Those are beautiful stories designed to keep you asleep. But that is complete fantasy. That was just the prologue. The real business, the industry of war, only truly started when the actual fighting stopped. And let me tell you, the reality was colder, crueler, and infinitely more profitable than any history book or official chronicle ever wanted to admit to the public. From the muddy fields of France to the blood-soaked sands of the Holy Land, every single soul on that battlefield knew exactly what the protocol was when the swords finally went quiet. Knights on horseback, the elites of their day, ran down men like sportmen whose only crime was desperately trying to survive the day. They used specialized daggers thin enough to slip through the gaps in the armor, driving them into groaning bodies to silence the witnesses forever. Then came the second wave, the civilians, the camp followers, the desperate peasants, women and children, the scavengers of the system. They swarmed over the dead and the dying like a biblical plague of locusts, tearing away chainmail, prying rings from stiffening fingers and cracking jaws open just to pull out teeth that could be sold on the black market. Captured nobles became nothing more than walking commodities, living ransoms. Their lives were negotiated and traded on the market just like grain futures or stocks today. And when the looting finally stopped, both sides faced mountains of rotting flesh. They dug the graves so fast that the bodies were thrown in layers, just stacking the dead like cordwood. The wells were poisoned by the stench of death, unleashing plagues that swept through the countryside, killing more people than the actual battle ever could have, a true pestilence upon the land. This is not some fiction dressed up to shock you into paying attention. This is what the bones testify to. This is what the monks secretly recorded in the margins. This is the dark chapter of warfare that historians and the powers that be have spent centuries trying to scrub from the record to keep you blind. Before we step onto that killing field together and walk through exactly how this machinery of death operated, I need to know who is standing watch with me today. Represent your location. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. Let's see how far across the globe this awakening reaches tonight. And if this is the history you always suspected was real, the hidden truth they never taught you in school, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on those notifications. Because what I'm about to reveal next is going to fundamentally shift how you see every medieval battle and every current event you have ever read about. Now take a deep breath and center yourself. We're about to stand on a battlefield where the fighting has already ended, but the horror is just starting. We are about to witness what really begins when the dust settles. Imagine you are locked inside a human wall, your shoulder grinding into the man beside you, knees bent, shield arms screaming in agony. All you can see through the sweat stinging your eyes is the enemy line and the terrifying glint of iron points reaching toward your face like the fingers of death. The noise is absolutely deafening, commanders screaming orders, the sickening crack of wood splitting the chaos of war. But as long as this formation holds, there is something almost like safety here. You move when you are told to move. You push forward when the signal comes. You are just one part of a massive machine. And that machine is the only thing keeping you from the grave. Then something shifts in the spirit. Somewhere to your left, the wall buckles. Maybe a man stumbles over a corpse. Maybe a wedge of enemy fighters punches through the line. Maybe someone starts a rumor that the cavalry on the flank has been routed and left you for dead. It doesn't matter what sparks it. Panic spreads faster than any order can travel. The solid mass of bodies becomes a crumbling dam about to burst. Men start shuffling backward. A shield clatters to the ground. Someone turns and runs. You feel the crowd behind you surge in the wrong direction. And then in one terrible moment, the line collapses. That is when the battle, as the history books describe it, officially ends. But what follows is not combat family. It is straight-up extermination. It is a harvest of souls. Medieval chroniclers admit sometimes reluctantly that most of the dead in major engagements were not killed in the grinding clash of shields. They died while they were running away. Accounts from the Crusader Wars and the great European conflicts record staggering numbers of men cut down. They were cut down or captured during the retreat alone, often exceeding the casualties from hours of actual fighting. The formal battle was over, but the slaughter had just begun. The real killing had just reached its peak. Inside the formation, you had advantages, you had a covering. You had shields on either side, brothers in front and behind you, officers bellowing orders and banners to guide your path. Even when losing ground, you could plant your feet and fight back. But once that structure shatters, every bit of protection vanishes in a heartbeat. Suddenly the veil is lifted and it is every man for himself in a valley of death. And the battlefield transforms into a hunting ground for the soldiers who have been held in reserve for exactly this specific moment. Because the horsemen were waiting. The commanders planned for this. They kept light cavalry out of the main fight, not to charge into locked shields, but to unleash the instant the enemy broke formation. We aren't talking about the heavy knights on massive war horses burdened with plate armor. We are talking about lighter riders on fast horses. Their purpose wasn't glorious single combat. Their job was brutally simple and ruthlessly efficient. Now I want you to really visualize this scenario, because this is the reality of what happens when order collapses and chaos takes over. Picture yourself as one of those fleeing soldiers, turning your back on the battle, running for your life, in a state of absolute terror. Your physical body is completely shut down. Your arms feel like they are weighed down by wet sand, totally useless. You have been swinging heavy steel and bracing against violent impacts for hours, fighting for survival in a meat grinder. That protective gear you are wearing, the gambeson or the chainmail, is soaked through. It is drenched with your own sweat, and in all likelihood it is stained with the blood of the men who fell beside you. The ground beneath your feet has turned into a nightmare. It is a sucking bog churned into mud by thousands of trampling boots. There are dead bodies littering the landscape, making it impossible to move fast. You cannot sprint. You can barely even walk. You are stumbling forward, driven only by the primal instinct to survive. But then you hear it. The sound that signals judgment is coming. You hear the thunder of hooves pounding the dirt right behind you. Let me tell you, there is almost no escaping that sound. When you are a man on foot, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor and exhausted to your very bones, you simply cannot outrun fresh cavalry across open ground. It is a mathematical impossibility. You are not going to make it through the meadows. You are not going to make it down the open roads. Not when you are already half dead from hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat. History books and ancient chronicles describe the aftermath in horrific detail, roads literally carpeted with corpses and narrow mountain passes completely choked with the fallen. We are talking about streams and rivers running dark red with blood. Desperate men try to splash across the water to safety, only to be cut down in the shallows like fish in a barrel. You have to understand at this point, this is no longer warfare. This is not two armies clashing. This is one side systematically butchering a fleeing mass of humanity that has lost the ability to defend itself. Now you might ask, could you just throw down your weapon and surrender? In theory, sure, that sounds like an option. But in the heat of this reality, that almost never happens. During a full-scale rout, a rider on a war horse is not going to slow down long enough for you to drop your blade, fall to your knees, and scream for mercy. There is no time for that. That rider does not know if your comrades are going to turn around and gut his horse. He does not know if you are worth anything as a hostage or a prisoner. He is operating on pure adrenaline and bloodlust. What he knows with absolute certainty is this: if he kills you right here and now, you will never regroup. You will never hold a spear against his people again. You will never stand in another shield wall to oppose him. Taking your life is the safest strategic choice he can make. Every single incentive in that moment points directly towards slaughter. The commanders and the elites running these wars understand one thing very clearly. A shattered army must be punished with total brutality, or else it might reform and fight again by tomorrow morning. Sending out light cavalry to hunt down the fugitives is the most efficient way to eliminate that danger permanently. So they chase them down. They hunt them for miles away from where the battle actually started. We see small clusters of exhausted men getting run down in open fields, on lonely country roads near villages, and even at the edges of the forest where they thought they had finally found sanctuary. Folks, this was not accidental violence. This was doctrine. This was the military standard operating procedure of the day. The survivors who actually lived through these pursuits often describe the retreat as being far worse than the battle itself. Think about it in the thick of the fighting. At least you had a weapon in your hand. At least you could swing back and defend yourself. But in the rout you are running with your spine exposed to a predator, whose entire purpose is to put a lance right through your back. You do not know when the blow is coming. You just know it is inevitable. That kind of relentless terror shatters the human mind. Soldiers collapse not just from their physical wounds, but from sheer panic and total spiritual exhaustion. And then the hoofbeats overtake them. Now a few might manage to escape through sheer luck or animal instinct, or maybe a combination of both. They throw themselves into muddy ditches. They crawl into the thick hedges like frightened rabbits trying to disappear. They flatten themselves in the tall grass or drag their battered bodies into shallow streams, praying that the murky water conceals them from the hunters. They lie there motionless, trying to silence their own breathing. Maybe the riders thunder past without stopping. Maybe they get passed over in the confusion. Or maybe they do not. But listen, even if they somehow survive this phase and the pursuit finally dies down, they do not rise up into safety. They have only crossed over into the next circle of horror. Because while the cavalry is out hunting those who flee the battlefield itself, is filling up with a different kind of victim. I am talking about the ones who cannot move at all. The men with shattered legs broken by the crush of war. Men with arrows buried so deep in their flesh they cannot be pulled free. Men who went down in the stampede and had an entire army trample right over top of them. When the thunder of battle fades, these are the ones left behind, scattered across the churned earth like debris, still breathing, still suffering. They are not rescued. They are processed. This is where the so-called mercy of the world begins, and it is a dark thing to behold. After the fighting ends, cleanup parties of soldiers move slowly across the field, step by careful step, scanning the ground. They are not searching for enemies to fight. They are searching for anyone still alive who is not supposed to be. They are looking to finish the job. Tucked into their sheaths or hanging from their belts, many of these men carry a thin, tapered dagger designed for one very specific, very grim purpose. Later centuries would give this weapon a poetic, almost gentle name, the Misericord, or the Dagger of Mercy. But make no mistake, its entire existence is built around a single function: killing wounded men quickly and efficiently. The blade is long enough to reach the brain or pierce the heart in a single thrust. It is narrow enough to slip right through the joints of plate armor, the gaps at the elbows and armpits, the visor slits of helmets, or the spaces between the ribs. Against a standing armored opponent ready to fight, this would not be your first choice of weapon. It is too small, too precise. But against someone lying helpless on the ground, unable to defend themselves, it is the perfect tool for the job. No hacking, no chopping, just find the gap and push. I want you to picture what this looks like in reality. You have been lying in the dirt for an hour or more, bleeding out into the cold mud. Maybe your leg is bent in a direction that makes you want to vomit just looking at it. Maybe your belly is torn open. The pain is beyond anything you have ever experienced in your life. It is consuming you. You are desperately thirsty, parched, and terrified. You see shapes moving between the bodies, silhouettes against the sky. You call out. You beg for help. One of them walks over and kneels beside you. For a brief, fleeting moment, you actually think you are being saved. Then, you see the cold steel tip hovering right over your eye socket. One hard, violent thrust penetrates the brain, and then absolute darkness. No more second chances. You have these secular historians and modern writers trying to spin this narrative, calling it compassion. They want to convince you that this demonic practice was actually mercy, supposedly better than letting the wounded suffer for days in agony. We have to look at the context. This was a primitive world without the medicine we take for granted, no antibiotics, no real surgery, just crude barbaric methods to dull the pain of a dying man. Back then, a gutted stomach or a crushed rib cage wasn't just an injury, it was a guaranteed death sentence, a slow, agonizing slide into the grave that the system couldn't stop. So, ending that torment instantly might look like mercy to the carnal mind. But family, don't be deceived, that word mercy is a mask. It hides the sinister reality of what was actually taking place on those blood-soaked fields. We are talking about the systematic liquidation of every enemy body that still had breath in its lungs. The motives here weren't rooted in love or kindness. This was cold calculation. You see, a victorious army in this fallen world doesn't want to deal with hundreds or thousands of broken men cluttering up the battlefield. Those wounded souls are nothing but a drain on resources. They require food, they need water, they need bandages and manpower to watch over them. Plus, there is always the fear that a dying snake can still bite you if you step too close. And if they heal, they might rise up to fight you again in the next season of war. Keeping them alive is a high-risk investment, but killing them, that is cheap, effective, and permanent. This is where that so-called mercy blade comes into play. It is the ultimate solution for a system that values efficiency over human life. It removes the heavy logistical burden, it wipes out future threats before they can rise, and it clears the stage for the vultures and the scavengers preparing to pick the bones clean. But let's go deeper, because not everyone on that ground even received the illusion of mercy. There was a separation taking place. If a man looked like he had value, if he wore the fine armor of the elite or carried symbols of wealth and status, he might be spared. Why? Because he could be ransomed. He was a commodity to be traded, not trash to be discarded. But if he looked poor, if he wore the rough, ragged gear of a common foot soldier, he was far more likely to feel the cold bite of the knife. Your worldly status determined your fate. One man's mercy was a quick execution, while another man's mercy was a chance to be sold back to his family for a bag of gold. And who was doing this dirty work? It wasn't the noble knights in shining armor posing for the paintings. No, this grim task fell to the grunts. Ordinary soldiers, sergeants, and the camp followers at the bottom of the hierarchy. These were the ones walking through the mud and gore, stepping over bodies, rolling men over to check if the spirit had left the vessel yet. Just take a moment to imagine the spiritual and psychological weight pressing down on those men. You just survived a brutal clash, you are shaking, bruised, maybe bleeding yourself. And now you have to spend hours driving steel into the faces and hearts of men who are begging you to stop. The history books and chronicles barely touch on what that kind of trauma did to the human soul. It had to leave deep, invisible scars that seared the conscience. But they used language to cover it up. The official reports just say the wounded were dispatched or relieved. They use these clean, clinical, deceptive words to sanitize the horror. When people read those phrases today, here in 2026, it sounds almost gentle, almost like an administrative procedure. But make no mistake, every single one of those tidy little terms represents a visceral, life-ending moment between two living souls. One man is lying helpless in the dirt, and the other is standing over him with a weapon. There is no prayer, no last rites, just a cold decision and the final thrust of the blade. It is critical for you to understand that mercy was often just a label used to conceal convenience. Many of these men were not on the verge of death. They were simply too much of a hassle to carry or too poor to be worth saving. Or maybe they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time when the order came down to clear the floor. That knife didn't ask any questions. If your gear said you were worthless to the system, your life was valued at zero. To our modern eyes, this looks like a horror movie. But to them, it was just another Tuesday. It was routine operation in a wicked world. Every army knew that after the clash of iron, the sweep teams would come through to finish the job. Suffering and mercy were bundled together and normalized. When you walk through museums today and look at those surviving daggers behind the glass, some of them have these intricate, beautiful hilts and elegant designs. It is disturbing to realize these weren't made for honorable combat. They were tools designed for the quiet execution of helpless men. That mixture of artistic beauty and grim, murderous purpose reveals just how deeply accepted this demonic practice really was in the culture. And when the men with the knives finally finish their dark assignment, the atmosphere shifts again. The shouting dies down. The majority of the wounded have been silenced forever. The cavalry is riding back from the chase. The sun starts to dip below the horizon, signaling the end of the day. For a fleeting moment, there is this eerie, supernatural stillness over the field, broken only by the groans of a few souls who somehow slipped through the cracks of judgment. But family don't get comfortable because it won't stay quiet for long. The next wave of parasites is already gathering at the edges of the slaughterhouse. You can hear the wooden carts creaking as they get dragged closer. The peasants are watching from the tree lines peeking out from the village lanes like vultures waiting to descend. The camp followers are tightening their belts, their eyes fixed on the spoils. They have been waiting for this specific moment, the time that comes after the war and the so-called mercy. At this point, those bodies on the ground are no longer viewed as enemies or soldiers. The world doesn't even see them as people anymore. They are about to be transformed into something else entirely. They become inventory, merchandise. And when those scavengers finally step onto that blood-soaked soil, the real business side of the battlefield kicks into high gear. It's all about profit now. The people who had been lurking at the fringes of the field had been listening intently the entire time. They heard the trumpets, the screams of the dying, the thunder of the battle lines colliding. They watched the smoke and the dust rise up to the heavens. They were waiting for that one specific sound that signaled their time had come. Silence. The silence of the grave. The instant the roar of combat faded and it became clear who the victor was, the carts began to roll. The groups of camp followers moved in. As the dust settled, the followers began their descent into the valley. You could see the doors creaking open in the nearby villages as the peasants who had been cowering in fear finally emerged from their hiding places to see what remained. The phase of slaughter and combat was officially ending, but the season of the harvest was just beginning. You have to understand, for these victorious soldiers, looting the dead wasn't just some extra bonus activity. This plunder was a major reason, perhaps the primary reason, they showed up to the battlefield in the first place. In those days, medieval pay was notoriously irregular, pathetic, or sometimes completely non-existent. The commanders and the captains knew how to manipulate their troops. They promised them the spoils of war and plunder far more often than they ever promised actual consistent wages. Once the enemy line had totally collapsed and the wounded were dealt with, the units were frequently given the green light to sweep across the threshing floor and seize absolutely anything they could carry. They didn't start by raiding the supply trains or the baggage wagons. No, they went straight to the source. They went directly for the bodies lying in the mud. To really grasp how frenzied and desperate this became, you need to understand what a soldier's equipment represented in raw economic terms during that era. A complete set of high-quality armor wasn't just protective gear, it was a fortune. It could cost more than a common laborer would earn in his entire miserable lifetime. A well-forged sword wasn't just a decorative possession or a wall hanger. It represented months or even years of hard labor and income condensed into a single piece of cold steel. Even the ordinary mundane items held immense value in this economy of scarcity. A sturdy leather belt, a solid pair of boots, or a wool tunic without too many rips were considered treasures. There was absolutely nothing on a corpse that was considered worthless. Every single item could be sold in the marketplace, traded for goods, or worn by the one who took it. And so the battlefield was instantly transformed into a gruesome industrial worksite. Men and women moved from body to body with a terrifying practiced efficiency. They sliced right through the leather straps on the breastplates and jerkins. They wrenched the helmets off heads and yanked those heavy chainmail shirts over stiffening dead limbs. They unlaced the padded armor and tore away the cloaks. The clothing was peeled off layer by agonizing layer until there was nothing left but bare exposed skin. Multiple historical accounts from the period note that within a matter of hours, thousands of the dead lay completely naked, not partially stripped, not half-dressed, but stripped down to us. This wasn't delicate work, family. It couldn't be gentle. The nature of the beast didn't allow for it. You have to realize that armor doesn't come off easily once a body has swelled, in the heat stiffened up in rigor mortis, or twisted into strange, unnatural positions from how it fell. The looters would roll the men over, plant a heavy foot squarely against a chest or a back, and pull with all their might until something finally snapped or gave way. Fingers that were too swollen to surrender their gold rings were simply snapped. Knives cut through stubborn lacing. If they had to slice through human flesh to reach the belts or pouches, they did it without hesitation. Sentiment and honor had no place on this field. Speed and profit mattered infinitely more than human dignity. And here is the detail that is truly difficult to confront directly. Not all of those bodies on the ground were actually dead. Some were just unconscious. Some were too weak from blood loss to resist the scavengers. Some were severely wounded but still fully aware, still feeling the pain, and still watching everything happen to them. Contemporary accounts describe wounded men being stripped naked right where they lay begging for a drop of water, while some stranger unbuckled their armor or ripped the boots off their feet. If they cried out too loudly or slowed down the production line, a blade across the throat could solve that problem in a heartbeat. For a looter caught up in that spirit of greed, there was no clear moral boundary between a living man and a corpse. It was all just inventory. The only line that mattered in that demonic atmosphere was the law of force. Can you stop me or not? And the scavengers descended in relentless waves. First came the victorious soldiers who held the right of first selection. They snatched up the finest armor and the highest quality blades available. They targeted the pieces clearly marked with noble colors or intricate craftsmanship. The officers and the nobles claimed the most expensive sets as the spoils of their rank. Once the elite had taken what they desired, the second wave of parasites moved in to pick the bones. This included the camp followers, the cooks, the laundresses, the blacksmiths, the assistants, the prostitutes, and the traders. Everyone who lived off the army but didn't stand on the battle line. These people knew exactly which parts of a soldier's kit were the easiest to resell for quick cash on the black market. After them came the locals. At first, the peasants crept forward nervously, afraid that the victors might still decide to kill anyone they spotted lurking near the dead. But once it became clear that the main army was too busy celebrating or marching away to the next conquest, the villagers arrived in much greater numbers. For someone who normally worked from sunrise to sunset for a meager, pathetic harvest, the sight of a field covered in equipment was absolutely staggering. Finding just one good helmet or a solid breastplate could completely transform a family's financial circumstances overnight. Even a pair of plain woolen leggings soaked in mud could be washed off and worn for years. They picked over whatever scraps remained, searching each body meticulously. But then there were also the professionals involved. In many of these campaigns, organized bands of looters followed the armies deliberately. They weren't loyal to either side of the conflict. They existed purely for the aftermath. These crews brought carts, specialized tools for extraction, and pre-established routes to the markets. They operated like teams on a modern construction site. One group focused on stripping the armor while another sorted the weapons. Another team loaded everything up and moved it out fast before the disease set in and the stench of death grew unbearable. They knew exactly which towns had buyers for plate metal, which had smiths who could melt down chainmail, and which dealers specialized in second-hand military gear. And as the humans worked their trade, the non-human scavengers arrived to take their share as well. Packs of dogs that had trailed the army's movement now snapped and tore at the exposed flesh of the fallen. Ravens and crows claimed the sky landing in flocks so dense that the chroniclers said they blotted out the sun. Wolves and strays skulked at the edges initially, then grew bolder, tugging at the limbs and faces of the dead. Wherever you found the scent of spilled blood and torn flesh, you would inevitably find the vermin gathering for their feast, swarming over the carnage like a plague sent for judgment. It was a chaotic scene where human scavengers often had to physically fight off the beasts of the field just to get their hands on a fresh corpse worth looting. This was raw, unfiltered competition for survival. Within 48 hours of a massive clash, the entire landscape would be transformed. The very same soil that mere hours ago had been carpeted with shining metal armor, colorful banners, and weapons of war was now stripped bare. In place of the armies of Babylon, the ground now held row after row of pale, naked bodies, broken shields, and the splintered remains of spear shafts, all testifying to the grim reality of mortality. You see, the valuable material didn't just vanish into thin air. It migrated into the hands of the survivors. A chest plate that once guarded a foreign knight against the sword might be hammered down and reshaped to serve a local warlord in the next county. A blade that was forged for war could be cut down, heated, and beaten into a plowshare or a farming tool, fulfilling a twisted version of prophecy through necessity. Even scraps of chainmail were not wasted. They were sliced apart and stitched into new clothing for the living. The battlefield was a gruesome marketplace that fed an entire supply chain of blacksmiths, tailors, wandering merchants, and the desperate souls who bought their wares. For the majority of the people involved in this grim harvest, this wasn't an act of cruelty or disrespect. It was simply the harsh requirement for staying alive in a fallen world. There was a universal understanding that the dead no longer held title to their earthly possessions. Once your body grew cold on the dirt, your vessel was one thing, but the gear upon it belonged to the first man quick enough to claim it. Decades later, you might find a man plowing his fields or walking into a house of worship on a Sunday morning. And he would be wearing leather boots peeled off the feet of a soldier who perished 10 miles away in a skirmish that history has long forgotten. Nobody asked where the boots came from. Questions like that were a luxury they couldn't afford. To them, they were just boots. But there was one major exception to this brutal leveling of the playing field, a rule that separated the elite from the masses. You have to understand that in the eyes of the system, not every defeated enemy was worth more dead than alive. Some men carried a value that required them to be kept breathing. And this is where we uncover the strangest, most twisted pillar of this entire beast system, something that echoes right into 2026. It is the concept of ransom. Picture yourself as a knight who has just been knocked off his high horse. You are lying on the ground, dazed and confused. Your shield is shattered, and your weapon is lying just a few feet beyond your grasp. Before you can even attempt to crawl toward your defense, 3 soldiers from the opposing army are piling on top of you. One of them pins your arms to the dirt. Another presses cold steel against your throat. But the third one is screaming at his comrades, commanding them to hold back their hands, shouting that you are an asset that must be preserved. In that split second, your life ceases to be a human existence and becomes a financial transaction. In the warfare of the Middle Ages, high-status prisoners were nothing more than liquid assets. If your family line held vast lands and generational wealth, your enemies knew they could squeeze a heavy payment out of them, much like the bankers squeeze the nations today. Capturing you became a massive business opportunity, a way to transfer wealth from one house to another without shedding more blood. Instead of finishing you off with a mercy strike, they would bind your wrists, drag you behind enemy lines, and immediately start bickering over who legally owned the rights to your ransom check. The system was so entrenched that there were established expectations and rough price lists, dictating exactly what a man of your rank was worth on the open market. A minor knight might fetch a 4-figure sum. A baron would command significantly more. But a famous lord or a prince, that was a fortune that could change a kingdom. A noble could ride into the heat of battle with the secret knowledge that if he fell and surrendered, he wouldn't get his skull split open like a commoner. There was a very high probability he would survive the day. This mercy didn't come from the goodness of their hearts, but because killing a noble would be the financial equivalent of setting fire to a treasure chest filled with gold. Once he was captured, he wouldn't be thrown in a dungeon hole. He might be housed in a castle or a private manor, guarded but comfortable, eating hot meals and allowed to write letters to his kin. He was given the privilege to negotiate his own release through intermediaries, acting as his own broker in the deal for his freedom. His family might have to sell off acreage, drain their vaults, or tax their peasant tenants into absolute poverty just to raise the funds, but the system ensured the bloodline continued. Sometimes, the trust among the elites was so established that a prisoner would be released on nothing more than his word, allowed to go home and collect his own ransom money. He would travel back to his estate, gather the gold, and either send the payment back or return in person as he had promised. The idea that a noble would break such a covenant was considered an absolute scandal. Your reputation and honor were currency, because if you became known as a man who lied about his ransom debts, no one would ever take you alive again. Next time, they would simply slaughter you where you stood. It was a perfect alignment of honor and self-preservation that kept the game running. Meanwhile, we have to ask what happened to the common soldiers. The men who didn't own land, the men who were like the sheep with no shepherd. Their families had no hidden treasures. There was no rate chart in the enemy camp with their names on it. For them, the logic of war was completely inverted. They were considered more trouble alive than dead. Feeding them and placing guards over them consumed resources that the army wasn't willing to spend. Releasing them for free meant they might just pick up a spear and fight against you in the next campaign season, so mercy was strategically unwise. So, more often than not, their story ended right there at the edge of a muddy ditch or in a forgotten corner of the field. A quick thrust, a shove, and they became just another anonymous body in the pile. Even in the rare cases when the commoners weren't killed, immediately their fate was grim and full of suffering. Some were forced into temporary slave labor, used as human mules to drag supplies, dig latrines, and haul heavy loads until they collapsed from exhaustion or became too inconvenient to keep. And once they were used up, they joined the rest of the dead discarded like broken tools. A tiny fraction might be spared if they possessed a specialized skill like blacksmithing, or if someone personally intervened, but the system was never designed to save them. The system was designed by the elites for the elites. The class divide was more decisive in determining who lived and who died than the battle itself. This meant that on a medieval battlefield, two men fighting shoulder to shoulder, bleeding for the same cause, could meet completely different fates the moment they fell. One bearing a noble name and a title might wake up under a clean roof treated as valuable cargo to be traded back to his people. The other, a farm boy conscripted into service, might be stripped naked, stabbed and dumped in a trench before the sun went down. Same wounds, same courage, same terror, but a different value in the eyes of man. It is the same old story that has plagued humanity since the fall, where your destiny on the battlefield was dictated entirely by your bloodline. The so-called elites of that dark age never saw a single contradiction in this rigged system. To them, that twisted hierarchy was simply the natural order of the world, a precursor to the very control grid we see tightening around us today. You have to understand that for the aristocracy, capturing wealthy enemies wasn't just an act of war. It was a lucrative business strategy, a way to merchandise human souls. These knights weren't just fighting for honor. They were actively hunting down their peers, looking to seize anyone with a high net worth who could be ransomed back to their families for a massive payday. The historical accounts are absolutely chilling, describing men in the heat of slaughter literally screaming out their family names and royal titles. They were desperate, shouting through the chaos, trying to make sure anyone recognized their financial value before some random nameless soldier struck them down and ended their potential for profit. It got so bizarre that you had soldiers fighting their own brothers in arms, trying to protect high-value captives from their own side's troops. They weren't saving these men out of mercy. They were protecting their investment from the bloodlust of the mob. They were physically shoving away anyone who might harm their prisoner, violently defending the enemy, because a dead nobleman couldn't sign a check. If that prisoner died, the payout evaporated, and in the eyes of these mercenaries, that was a financial disaster they could not allow. Think about the spiritual darkness of that scene, right in the middle of a literal killing field. You suddenly have people guarding enemy lives, not from a place of compassion or Christian charity, but from pure, unadulterated greed. It is the perfect picture of how the love of money twists the human soul. When you take a step back and look at the big picture, you can see how the looting and ransom systems interlocked to form a demonic economy of death. The dead poor were stripped naked, recycled into raw materials, their gear, and metal fed back into the beast system to keep the war machine churning. Meanwhile, the living rich were converted into walking sacks of credit, treated like commodities on a stock exchange, rather than human beings. It was the ultimate dehumanization, separating the wheat from the tares based solely on the size of their purse. We need to wake up to the fact that war was never merely about territory or religion or who wore the crown. Those are just the narratives they feed the masses. At its core, war was a massive, brutal financial engine, and for the people at the top of the pyramid, a military campaign was just a high-risk business venture designed to consolidate power. But for the people at the bottom, the common folks like you and me, it was a rigged lottery where 99% of the tickets paid out, in nothing but suffering and death. It is the same dynamic we see playing out right now in 2026, where the poor are ground into dust to build the empires of the wicked. But even after every single purse had been emptied, after every piece of armor had been hauled away by the scavengers, and every noble had been sorted into piles of dead alive or captured for cash, there was something remaining that nobody wanted to claim. It was the sheer overwhelming mass of bodies, the discarded vessels of thousands of souls who had been sacrificed on the altar of war. This is the part of history the movies don't show you, the grim reality that sets in when the glory fades. Thousands of men, and often their horses, lay out in the open, baking under the sun, as the biological reality of death took hold. The stench grew worse by the hour, a physical manifestation of the spiritual rot that had taken place on that field. The flies swarmed so thick, You could literally taste them on your tongue, a plague of biblical proportions descending on the feast. Nearby wells and streams began to turn foul, poisoned by the fluids of the dead, threatening to spread pestilence to the living. By this point, the gold had been counted and the prisoners sorted, but the judgment was just beginning. The real crisis was just starting to ramp up because you cannot loot your way out of a carpet of rotting corpses. The elites could take the money and run, but the land itself was crying out from the blood that had been spilled, just like in the days of Cain and Abel. You simply cannot ransom a pile of swelling, fly-covered dead men. They have no value to the system anymore. So someone had to answer a brutal, urgent question that nobody wanted to face in the aftermath of the slaughter. How in the world do you dispose of 10,000 bodies before they poison an entire region and trigger a plague that wipes out the survivors? This is the logistical nightmare that follows the wrath of man. The solution they came up with was simple in concept, but absolutely horrifying in scale, and it would leave scars in the earth that archaeologists can still uncover today. These pits stand as a testimony against the violence of the past, waiting for the earth to disclose her blood. There is a specific moment, maybe a day or two after the battle ends, when even the victors can't pretend anymore. The adrenaline wears off, the demonic high of violence fades, and the cold hard reality of what they have done settles in. At first they are intoxicated by their survival and the plunder they've stolen. They sit around their fires, boasting, counting their blood money, arguing over which prisoners belong to whom, and dictating arrogant letters about their glorious triumph to send back home. But then the wind changes direction, and the atmosphere shifts spiritually and physically. That thick, sweet, sickening stench of blood and decay rolls through the camp, a reminder that death is the ultimate conqueror in this fallen world. Flies begin to swarm around every single scrap of food, making it impossible to eat without ingesting the filth of the battlefield. Men start retching and gagging when they walk too close to the field, their bodies rejecting the horror they are witnessing. Even the horses, which are sensitive creatures, refuse to walk down certain paths entirely because they can smell the death in the air. The celebration has to end abruptly because the dead are demanding attention and nature itself is starting to revolt against the carnage. The army leadership wants absolutely nothing to do with this cleanup operation. The commanders just want to advance to the next conquest, pursue the fleeing enemy, or march home to their parades. The common soldiers just want to rest, spend their loot on vices, or simply escape that god-forsaken place before they catch a disease. But thousands of corpses do not just vanish into thin air because nobody feels like handling them. The bill has come due. Somebody has to do the dirty work. Somebody has to clean up the mess left behind by the ambitions of the powerful. And more often than not, that somebody is the local population, the peasants who never asked for this battle to happen on their land in the first place. The winners issue the orders from their high horses, and the local peasants are forced to pick up the shovels and bury the strangers who destroyed their fields. But before any digging begins, there is one final calculated sweep across the field with a very different purpose. This isn't about respect, it's about checking the inventory one last time. They send in the heralds and retainers to recover the important dead, the VIPs of the medieval world. They walk between the bloating bodies, examining torn surcoats, shields, and armor, desperately trying to identify men of high rank so they can separate the elite from the common rabble even in death. If they find a great lord or a duke, his body is pulled aside immediately. Even as a corpse, he has privileges that the common man is denied. Maybe his body will be transported home for a proper burial in the family crypt, wrapped carefully in fine linens and cleaned, as well as the grim circumstances allow. They try to sanitize the death of the rich, hiding the gruesome reality behind ceremony. There might be prayers said over him, candles lit in cathedrals, and eventually a marble tomb carved with his name to immortalize his legacy. But almost everyone else, the masses who fought and died, receives absolutely none of that dignity. The thousands of common soldiers who fell in the charge, who were trampled in the rout, or finished off with mercy blades and knives in their backs. During the looting, they are just statistics now. They are the collateral damage of a system that views them as disposable. They are not going home to their families. No one is matching their names to their faces. Their identities are being erased from the earth as if they never existed. No one is asking who they were, what dreams they had, or who loved them back in their villages. They are about to become nothing more than a public health crisis that needs to be solved with efficiency and speed. The solution is large holes, pits, trenches, whatever the ground will permit them to dig. You cannot dig one proper grave for each man. The sheer volume of death makes individual dignity impossible. There simply isn't enough time, labor, or space on the map. So the order goes out from the top down. Start digging here. It is a mass disposal of human beings, treating them like refuse. Men with shovels and picks begin breaking the earth, laboring under the heavy conviction of death. Sometimes they have to dig through rocky soil that resists every strike, sometimes through muddy fields already torn apart by iron hooves and heavy cartwheels. They know deep down they are racing against time and nature. Every single hour they spend digging, the bodies, lying out in the sun, deteriorate further, swelling and bursting, adding to the horror of the task. You have to consider the massive scale involved here. Even a minor engagement in medieval times could leave hundreds of men dead on the field. A major battle created literal carpets of corpses stretching across the hills and fields as far as the eye could see. It was a harvest of death that defies our modern comprehension. To bury thousands of people, you are not talking about a modest trench or a small graveyard. You are talking about massive cuts in the earth, long and deep scars in the landscape. These pits had to be large enough to swallow entire companies of men at once. And remember, this is all accomplished by hand without the aid of modern excavators or bulldozers. No machinery, just raw muscle straining in the summer heat, or freezing in the bitter cold, done by people who are already exhausted, traumatized, and terrified of falling ill themselves from the pestilence radiating from the dead. Sometimes they simply ran out of time entirely, and the earth claimed them as they lay. One of the most famous excavated battle sites from a clash on a scorching summer day revealed skeletons still encased in their armor, left exactly where they fell, abandoned by the kings. They served a stark warning to us all in these end times. This level of accelerated decay suggests a biological breakdown so rapid and intense that it feels like a curse from the Old Testament. The bodies were rotting so fast that the burial crews in 2026 could not even strip them of their gear first. There was zero time for reverence or traditional rites. They had to seize the remains in whatever horrific condition they found them and shovel them into the cold ground before the pestilence could spread further. They buried them with their weapons, their metal, and their supplies, simply because the stench of death and the swarms of flies, reminiscent of the plagues of Egypt, became a physical weight that was impossible for any living man to bear. You need to really meditate on how desperate the situation in America must become before you start burying valuable equipment that could essentially feed or protect your entire village for a full year. That is the definition of a society in total collapse. The actual logistics of moving the dead during the Black Awakening is a nightmare distinct from regular warfare. You see people dragging the lifeless shells of their neighbors by the wrists or ankles just to clear the streets. They stack them onto makeshift carts until the wheels are literally sinking into the blood-soaked earth, using rusted iron hooks and ropes because the fear of touching that bloated, cursed flesh with bare hands is overwhelming. But in this scenario, protective gear is a luxury of the past. Gloves are scarce, and simple cloth masks do absolutely nothing to block the smell of mortality that hangs over the valley. The physical reality of the judgment is gruesome. Limbs pull loose from the sockets, clothing tears away in wet clumps, and bodies literally split open under the pressure of their own corruption. The survivors performing this grim labor do not have the luxury of looking away or mourning. When they reach the burial pits, the bodies go in fast, with absolutely no careful arrangement or dignity. We are looking at a mass disposal where men are dumped in chaotic layers side by side, stacked on top of each other, like firewood for the fire that never goes out. You see arms, twisted necks bent at unnatural angles, and faces pressed into the backs and chests of strangers. The only goal here is making them fit into the hole, not providing any semblance of honor. A relentless line of workers tips cart after cart into the trench, while others stand ready with shovels to immediately start throwing dirt the second the pit looks like it can't hold another ounce of sin. The absolute priority in these end-time scenarios is getting the dead covered and out of sight as quickly as humanly possible to hide the scale of the tragedy. Sometimes you will see white lime scattered over the bodies before the soil is pushed back in a desperate attempt to control the smell and accelerate the decay process so the living can try to forget. But you have to understand the economics of the apocalypse. Lime is not cheap as it has to be quarried, burned, and transported across supply lines that may no longer exist. Using such a valuable resource in mass graves means the situation has become so dire that people are willing to spend their last tangible assets just to make the area somewhat livable again. Even with those measures, the ground above those graves steams and sinks as the physics of decomposition take over. For weeks, the earth settles as the bodies beneath collapse into themselves, literally reshaping the landscape. And then we have to talk about the horses, because the prophecy speaks of the beasts of the earth perishing as well. A battlefield is a slaughterhouse for animals just as much as it is for men. War horses pack animals and local livestock trapped in the path of this spiritual and physical warfare, all fall victim to the same destruction. A single horse weighs several times what a man does, creating a massive logistical problem for the sanitation crews left behind to clean up the mess. Moving a carcass of that magnitude requires a team of strong men or surviving animals, assuming any are healthy enough to pull. And sometimes these beasts are thrown into separate pits to avoid contaminating the human graves. But in the chaos of the Black Awakening sometimes, they are simply dragged to the edges of the field and abandoned to the elements because there is no strength left to bury them. Their massive bulk rots for weeks, feeding the flies, the stray dogs, the wolves and the crows, the birds of the air, gathering for the great supper mentioned in Revelation. These burial sites do not simply fade from the collective memory. The people who survive in the region know exactly where the bodies are sown. They know which meadow hides a pit full of dry bones beneath the grass, and they pass that dark knowledge down through the remnant. They know exactly which slope should not be plowed too deep, because the plowshare will catch on human skulls and ribs, and sometimes they mark the spot with a rough wooden cross or a piled stone. Other times they simply avoid building houses or planting crops there. And generations grow up hearing the same whispered warning, "Do not dig in that field. That is where the soldiers are sleeping." Centuries later, when modern construction crews and archaeologists cut into the earth for new roads or foundations, they uncover these mass graves and the truth comes spilling out. The pattern is always the same, repeating throughout history as a testimony to the brutality of man when he turns away from God. You find deep pits, tangled bodies, little to no clothing, no personal markers and no coffins, just layers of people thrown together and sealed under the dirt waiting for judgment. The bones reveal everything we have been discussing about the violence of the end times. Blunt force trauma to skulls, stab wounds, shattered limbs, and evidence of a hard life. The dead were not honored in these moments. They were merely managed, treated like a waste management problem, rather than human beings created in the image of God. What is truly remarkable is how little ritual there typically was for the bulk of the fallen. Perhaps a priest stood beside one pit and mumbled a generic prayer, but the spirit was absent. Maybe a few handfuls of earth were blessed in the name of God, but there were no individual ceremonies for the thousands of ordinary soldiers who were ground up by the war machine. There were no names called aloud, no weeping families present to say goodbye. It was cold, industrial, and utterly devoid of closure. They died far from home and disappeared into the ground with nothing to mark that they had ever existed, while their commanders might be remembered in the history books. They became anonymous fertilizer for the next generation's harvest. And you might assume that once the bodies were buried, the danger had passed, but you would be wrong. It had not passed at all. Burying people in mass pits slows certain problems, but it does not magically eliminate the curse that lingers over the land. Beneath the soil, those bodies are still decomposing and the fluids of death are seeping downward into the hidden places of the earth. Gas forces its way up through the loose earth like a toxic spirit, and if the pits are too shallow, the wild beasts will dig back in and expose the horror all over again. If these graves are located near water sources, the rot leaches into the groundwater, poisoning the wells and streams that the survivors rely on. People drink from those sources with no idea what is now mixed in with their water. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria, but they knew that after mass death, the plague always follows. They spoke of corrupted air and pestilence rising from the battlefield, recognizing that something spiritual and physical was polluting their environment. They noticed that the villages downwind or downstream from these mass graves always had more sick inhabitants, a physical manifestation of the curse. They couldn't explain the science, but they could see the prophetic pattern clearly first: the battle, then the burials, and finally the disease that cleanses the land. We cannot afford to turn a blind eye to the horrific reality of how the people were forced to exist when the smoke finally cleared. You have to understand, We are talking about thousands of men, often the poor and the downtrodden, crammed into these makeshift camps or forced into local villages like cattle awaiting the slaughter. The sanitation was non-existent, a breeding ground for pestilence. The latrines weren't proper facilities. They were shallow, hastily dug ditches overflowing with filth. Garbage and waste would pile up high, becoming a monument to human misery. It was a scene of absolute chaos where beasts of burden were penned up right next to where exhausted men tried to sleep. Washing your body was a luxury that simply didn't exist, especially when the winter winds of judgment began to blow. Finding clean water in these hellscapes becomes nearly impossible because every nearby source has been poisoned by death and waste. Now throw the wounded into this demonic environment, men with injuries that are already festering and filthy. The weapons of war, swords, axes, and iron were never sterile. They were instruments of infection. Arrows didn't just pierce the flesh. They dragged mud, rust, and dirty rags deep into the body, planting the seeds of gangrene right then and there. Bones were shattered into splinters. Flesh was torn open like cheap fabric. The surgeons of that day would saw, cut, and probe with bloody tools used on a dying man just minutes before wiping the blade on a dirty sleeve before turning to the next victim. There were no antibiotics to save them, no sterile bandages to cover the shame, and absolutely zero understanding of the demonic nature of how infection consumes the body. A simple cut that you wouldn't even worry about in 2026 could be an absolute death sentence for a warrior back then. It was a slow, agonizing slide into the grave. It starts with a week of rising fever, the body burning up, followed by a spreading rot that consumes the flesh. Once that disease takes hold, it doesn't care about your flag, your banner, or what language you speak. It is the great equalizer. Dysentery would sweep through the camp like a biblical plague, turning the very water they drank into a weapon that liquidated them from the inside out. Fevers jumped from tent to tent like wildfire in a dry season. Fleas and lice hopped from body to body, spreading sickness without mercy. Rats moved freely, scurrying between the edges of mass graves and the lines of sleeping men carrying the pestilence of the dead to the living. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. The camp followers, the merchants, the women, the servants, the entire support system fell under the shadow of death and illness too. Then unwittingly, they became agents of destruction, returning home and carrying that sickness into towns and villages that had never even seen the battlefield. They brought the war home in their blood. Historians often miss this, but sometimes more souls perished in the weeks following a campaign consumed by plague than in the largest, bloodiest clash of the actual war itself. A commander might win what looks like a stunning victory driving off the enemy, only to watch his own army disintegrate and crumble as illness tears through the ranks like a wolf among sheep. There are documented files and cases where entire armies had to abandon cities they had just captured because they didn't have enough healthy men left to hold the walls. The conquerors became the casualties. The victory poisoned itself. That is the power of the invisible aftermath, the judgment that follows the sword. This grim reality quietly dictated military strategy more than any genius generals ever did. The leaders who actually had wisdom understood that lingering too long near a site of great bloodshed was inviting a catastrophe of biblical proportions. They tried to move their forces through quickly, desperate to get their men away from the swollen, rotting corpses and the water sources that had turned to poison. They ordered rapid, shallow burials to hide the carnage. They sometimes burned entire sections of their own camps or destroyed contaminated supplies in a frantic attempt to stop the spread. But without real knowledge, these were just shots in the dark. In the end, luck played a bigger role than planning, and death often claimed the victor anyway. When you put all these pieces together, the Hollywood image of medieval warfare completely collapses. The glorious charge, the clash of steel, the banners waving high, it's all a deception. That is what the system, the art, and the cinema want you to see. But that was only the first step in a long chain of misery. First came the chaotic rout and the hunting down of men fleeing for their lives. Then came the so-called mercy blades and the quiet, brutal executions of the wounded who were of no value to the conquerors. Then came the stripping and looting, converting human beings into piles of useful objects. Then came the cold, calculated sorting of captives who was worth a ransom check and who was just waste. Then came the mass pits, followed by the disease. None of this was an exception or a rare tragedy. This was the rule. This was the standard script for the age. Everyone living in that world understood the game. Soldiers knew that if their line broke, the cavalry would ride them down like grass. Wounded men knew that the person walking toward them wasn't coming to offer water, but to finish them off with a dagger between the ribs to save resources. The peasants and the common folk knew that after the noise of battle stopped, there might be scraps to loot, but they would be forced to dig the graves for the dead. The nobles knew their sons might return home if the ransom was paid, or not at all if their fortune ran out. No one involved found this system shocking. It was just life in the beast system. It was simply how the machine of war operated. We are the ones shocked today because we have sanitized the story and hidden the blood under the rug of history. We discuss chivalry, honor, and glory. We talk about great leaders and strategic victories. We maybe spare one sentence for the heavy losses or the dead, and then we quickly move on to the next topic. But if you truly want to understand the spirit of war, you have to stand in that field a day later. You have to witness the aftermath of the wrath. You have to look at the naked, stripped bodies. You have to smell the stench rising from the mass graves that fills the air with the scent of death. You have to watch the villagers shoveling dirt over men they never knew, trying not to breathe too deeply lest they catch the sickness themselves. The most disturbing element isn't even the blood. Humans have been killing each other since Cain slew Abel. The disturbing element is how organized, systematic, and cold the whole process was. The way the killing, the looting, the ransom negotiations, the burials, and the disease all interlocked into a machine that operated smoothly for centuries. That is the horror. It was a machine built on the demonic premise that some lives were valuable assets to be traded and others were disposable trash to be discarded. That some bodies deserved careful transport home and marble tombs, while others were just rotting hazards to be shoved into holes as quickly as possible to protect the elite. It is easy for us to look back from 2026 and say they were monsters, but that lets everyone off the hook too easily. They didn't wake up thinking they were villains. They told themselves they were doing what was necessary, protecting their kingdom, feeding their families, following orders, and just trying to survive in a brutal world with no good options. The more you meditate on that, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because it raises a blunt prophetic question for us today. What abominations do we treat as normal right now that future generations will look back on and find equally horrifying and demonic? When you strip away the armor, the shields, and the banners, the people in those pits were not that different from you and me. They were frightened souls. They were ambitious. They loved their families. And they were caught in the gears of a system that didn't care if they lived or died. Just hours before the slaughter, they were sitting around crackling fires, cracking dumb jokes, and sharing fleeting moments of joy. They were just trying to survive inside a massive, crushing machine that had been churning and grinding long before they ever took their first breath on this earth. But when the smoke clears, and you look at the aftermath, the battlefield exposes exactly what that beast of a system truly valued all along. It wasn't about their courage, and it certainly wasn't about their loyalty to the crown. It was strictly about their utility and the profit margins of the elite. The cold truth is that if you were considered an asset, you might get permission to live a few hours longer. But the moment you ceased to be useful to the powers that be, you were discarded and tossed straight into the dirt without a second thought. So the next time you find yourself visualizing a medieval war, do not let your mind stop at the glorious charge or the clash of swords. You need to let that mental camera keep rolling and see what happens when the glory fades. Listen closely for the sound of galloping hooves hunting down broken men who are running for their lives. Visualize the glint of daggers in the hands of exhausted soldiers as they walk among the wounded, deciding who is worth saving and who gets the blade. Watch the scavengers stripping the valuable armor off the corpses, while the human bodies just pile up like garbage. Then witness the mass graves yawning open, the dead being thrown in, like refuse, the earth covering the sins, and the inevitable pestilence drifting out to curse the land. That is the full, unvarnished story that the history books often gloss over. That is the grim, ugly reality of what victory actually looked like for the common man on the ground. If you have walked this path with me and faced these hard truths all the way to this point, I want to thank you for sticking around to the very end of the broadcast. If this message has shifted your perspective on the reality of ancient warfare, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and hit the like, so you are locked in and don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden history of the world. And do me a favor, share this transmission with someone who is still asleep. someone who still believes that the era of knights and castles was nothing but clean, noble, and romantic fairy tales. They need to wake up and see exactly what that battlefield looked like the moment the fighting stopped and the silence finally took over.